Okay, so what we are going to be doing today is double face tablet weaving, which is a technique where we use the tablets. Each of them have 4 threads, and I've set up with 20 cards, and the way I've set up the cards is every card has 2 white threads and 2 red threads. And then I've also set them up so that when I threaded them, for the first one the string goes from left to right through the card. The next one it goes from right to left, and then left to right, and right to left. This is known as alternating SZ threading, and it really doesn't matter which one you do first, so we're not going to worry about what constitutes S and what constitutes Z. We're just alternating is the key point. Now the second thing that we're going to do, now that we've set this up, we've checked that the cards turn freely, and now it's time to start the weaving. And what I like to do is I like to do a couple of turns where we just go straight forward to make sure I've set up the cards correctly. As well, I like to have a natural starting point to beat against, hence the popsicle stick. So I put in a popsicle stick in the shed, turn all the cards, put in another popsicle stick, turn the cards. Now when I cut this off the loom, I can either, if I'm making site tokens or bookmarks, I can cut between the popsicle sticks and get an evenly sized fringe. So right now I've started, or I'm about to start, and the first thing I do when you start is you start with your string. Here's my shuttle, and I'm going to leave myself a long tail because what I'm going to do is I'm going to weave the tail back into the weaving so that that edge will already be finished. So right now I'm just turning all the cards at once. Put the shuttle through, pull it through, well, drop the shuttle. Very important to drop the shuttle. And on the other side, I've got the tail, and I pull that through in the other direction. And I'm not going to tighten right now. Instead, I'm going to turn the cards and beat with the shuttle. And now is when I'm going to tighten, because now the previous threads are trapped in a little channel, so there's more friction, so it's harder to over tighten, because a very common mistake with double face is to pull it too tight. And if you pull it too tight, it gets ugly and cramped. And so as I'm doing it, I'm checking that I've got all my cards set up correctly. I know that I've got all of them warped correctly, but sometimes one of them may have gotten turned around. So if I've got them all set up correctly, I should be getting horizontal lines, and the alternating threading is why you get the little V's. Now some people prefer to double face weave with all the cards facing in the same direction. Preferences vary. You get slightly different effects, and it's fun to experiment. I just find the alternating to suit me best. Okay, 2 more picks. A pick is when you pass the shuttle through once. So we'll finish this one, and then 1 more pick, and in this last one, remember that tail that I've been dragging around? Well, I don't want to keep weaving with it forever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and then just drop it somewhere in the middle down below. So it's going to go through part of the shed and then disappear underneath. And eventually when I take it off the loom, that's when I will come back and just cut it even with the fabric and wiggle the fabric, and it's gone. So at this point, again, beat. Now I have to be careful when I tighten that tail, but from now on I can ignore it. And I'm looking at this, and when you look at this, notice it's a little bit uneven. I really need to tighten it up just a little bit more. But you can adjust that slightly by running your fingers across the top. And now I've started weaving. Now I'm going to start double face. Now when you're weaving double face, there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of, some vocabulary. The first thing I'm going to talk about is whether the color is horizontal or vertical. If the whites, the 2 whites, are one above the other, that's vertical. When they're like this, that would be horizontal. Now in double face, whenever the colors are horizontal, you just do the same thing you just did. You repeat. The only time we change cards and move them around is when they're in vertical position. Second point. On each side of the deck, we have 2 salvage cards. The salvage cards kind of tell us what's going on, and they're going to continuously move forward. So when we're weaving, if cards are with the salvage card, they're moving forward. If they're away from the salvage cards, they would be moving backwards in the opposite direction. And the third thing that we're going to talk about briefly is we're going to talk about how many decks we're going to have. We're actually going to have 2 decks, a background deck and a foreground deck, which is currently completely empty. So we have to keep in mind we have 2 decks, but if there's no cards in one of them, we just ignore it for a moment. And then when we look at the pattern, in the pattern, the way I have it graphed here, I've got the salvage on the edges. That tells me what to do. Each card is 1 rectangle, and each rectangle is 2 picks long. So from vertical position, turn, turn again, you're back in vertical. So if I've got a gray rectangle, that means that that card is going to be in the foreground deck. If it's white, it's going to be the background deck. Now I decided in this case to keep it very close to the pattern that my background is going to be white. It is really helpful sometimes to write down what your background and foreground color are. So we're going to use white for background, red for foreground. So I'm going to start at the bottom row. The bottom row says that the salvage cards, now I can tell which color is coming up on the salvage cards by looking at the top front hole. If that's a white thread, then when I turn it forward, I'm going to get white. If it was red, I would get red. So when I look at the first row, the fact that the salvage is white tells me that the white has to be closest to me. And if it was red right now, then I would do 1 more pick of just the horizontal lines just to get it to set up. So this says everything is with the background deck, and the background deck is white. So I weave 2 picks. One pick, 2 picks. And I come to the next line, and the next line, notice now here this is the red, the foreground color. So if this color is the foreground color, then the salvage needs to be with the foreground deck, which happens to be otherwise empty. So now for these 2 turns, foreground deck is going to turn forward. These are no longer with the salvage. They've got to turn the opposite way. And again, it's always in double face. Everything is a matter of 2 picks, because right now the colors are horizontal. Right now nothing moves between the 2 packs. So the salvage turns forward. That means that the non-salvage turns backwards. Now we come to the first line of the pattern, where something actually starts happening. We have the start of this ball. So this pattern says the salvage is back with the white, and I count in, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards are left with the salvage. 2, 4, 6. Then I pick 4 cards to go into the foreground, and another 6 cards to stay with the background. So at this point, salvage is where it belongs to be. It's going to be the background color, so it's with the background deck. These turn forward. That means that these turn back. And again, we've got the 2 picks. Now the tension on mine is beginning to build a little bit because I'd only just warped, so I'm going to release tension just a smidge. If the cards don't want to turn, it's usually because you've got the tension too tight. But you don't want to back it up so much that all the cards fall over. So here's the first row of our pattern. Now one of the things that happens is because we have the alternating Z threading, we're going to get the little V's. If we had all the cards threaded the same way, we'd have them all going in little diagonals in one direction. Now, the other thing that happens, I've got a shuttle with a hole in it, so that when I drop it, nothing happens. That just means that when I feed string off the shuttle, I've got to remember to pull it off on the side away from the hole, otherwise you get a knot. Knots don't work. So we come to the next line of the pattern. The next line of the pattern, I've got a red here, so I know that the selvage needs to be with the background, with the foreground, and the background is up here. And when I look at the pattern, I notice that there's one more card on each side of the 4 that I'd already put up. So I just go ahead and slide those 2 up. Turn the background backwards because it's got no selvage. Turn the selvage forwards. And off we go. And again, always 2 picks. You never move the cards between the 2 decks unless they're vertical, unless you've got the same color in the 2 front holes. When you first start weaving, it's very common to move them when they're horizontal. And with double face, you don't. You want to keep them in the 2 decks and only move when they're vertical. Now, the next line of the pattern is just like the previous line, except that the selvage, where it was red before, is now white in this hole. So the selvage moves to the background. So the background now turns forwards, and the foreground turns backwards. And slowly but surely, okay, if you have scissors, this would be a good time to cut that tail to get it out of the way. If not, you just string it out of the way. Or one of your students shows up with scissors. Now you don't have to cut it very carefully, just don't cut the string in the shuttle, because that gets awkward. Now at this point I interrupted my weaving, so I have to check, and when I check the current shed, the shuttle hasn't gone through yet. So I go ahead and put the shuttle through, pull it through. Now if I ever stop weaving, when I start back up, I always check, are the colors vertical or horizontal? Because if they're vertical, then I need to figure out where I am on the pattern. If they're horizontal, I need to remember to finish out that row before I start looking where I am on the pattern. When I'm really lucky and I have no interruptions, I just never stop when it's horizontal. But there are times when emergencies happen. So we just finished the 3rd row. We're coming to the 4th row. The 4th row says the selvage is back with the foreground. So we move it up. And then it says that as far as the foreground colors go, we lose the 2 outside cards. So we drop them back to the background. And again, 2 picks. So 1 pick, 2 pick. 3 pick 4, 5 pick, 7 pick, 7 pick more. And at this point, we've got the shape that we have here. Now, when you're weaving, you want to be careful what string you pick because you're always going to be seeing little dots in the center. Depending on how thick your thread is, that may be more or less obvious. Sometimes you can use it as a design feature by picking a nice contrasting weft thread. I went with the white, so it's going to pop up a little bit against the red, but not enough to really be a problem. The reason it does that is because when you're doing the cards 2 forwards, 2 back, you're basically laying, weaving stitches, for lack of a better word, that curve first from right to left and then from left to right. And so you've got gaps between the curves. And the only way to solve that is to pull it really, really, really tight, but then your designs get really, really squished. And so unless your designs are compensating for being really, really squished, we're back to it not looking as good as it could. Any questions?
Not yet.
Because we can edit the questions out, but I can answer them.
You've got your selvage going on, off.
Right.
Is that important to do in all of these patterns, or does it just happen to be the way that you did it in this pattern?
Now, in this particular pattern, I had the selvage going on, off, because the selvage cards are actually threaded exactly the same as the pattern cards. very often once you get more advanced, you start doing with selvage that's all the same color, or you might have different extra patterns that you can put in the selvage. But when I first start weaving double face, or when students first start, I like to have all the cards identical. And so at that point you would get 2 on, 2 off, because you would get 2 white and then 2 red, and then 2 white and 2 red when you keep turning. That reminds me of a different, notice that we've already got a bit of twist build up here in the selvage. And eventually we'll get worse and worse and worse because the selvage always consistently turns forward. So what we're going to do is we're going to fix that, but we're actually, this is the one time, the only time you make a change when the cards are horizontal. What we're going to do is first we're going to go to the next row of the pattern, because what happens is there's a way that I can fix the twist so it starts reversing, but if I flip the card here, then instead of white coming up, I'm going to get red. And my pattern's going to break because the white and the red won't match up anymore. So as long as you're still writing down the selvage, it's important that you make this change when it's horizontal. Once you make the selvage all the same color, or it becomes less important, once you've got the muscle memory, then you can change it whenever you feel like it. But right now, so we're coming to the next line in the pattern. The selvage is white, so we move it down. And then we notice that those 4 cards are going to come down, and on either side, 4 cards are going to move up. So I'm going to count the 4 cards on the left, move them up, move the 4 cards down, and move the next 4 up. And at this point, I'm going to make my first turn, which starts the second set of the balls in the pattern. And note that now, if I flip the selvage like this, I've still got the white on top. And by flipping, sorry, and then I promptly tripped it. By flipping the card around its vertical axis, what happens in this case is when I turn it forward, it's going to have the effect as if it was being turned backwards. So it's going to unwind all the twist that built up. Let me do the other side too. So again, you take the card, and there's only ever one way that you can turn it. You can't turn it the other way because there's string in the way. So you turn it the way it can go, and you turn it the way it can go. And now I finish out my second pick, turn that forward. The foreground had no selvage, it turns backwards. And now you're going to get a funny bubble at the edge, which is a weaving structure and not really anything you can do about it. If you're weaving this as a kind of backstrap loom where you tie one end to your waist and the other end to the wall, then you can work out the twist that way. But if you're on an inkle type loom, then you've got to find a way of dealing with the twist, and usually the way is to reverse the cards and keep going. So we'll do one more line just so we can see where the side disappears. We're back to red or foreground for the selvage, and the pattern says for each of these 2 sets of 4, add 1 card on the outside. So we go ahead and we add 1 card on the outside of each of the 2 groups. So now what I've got left for background is I've got 1 card, 2 cards in the middle, and 1 card on the far end. And again, this has no selvage, it turns backwards. This has selvage, it turns forwards. Off we go. And the one, well, I won't call it a big change, but the change that you can see with selvage, before they were little V's that were pointing down, now they're going to be little V's, because I'm using silk and silk is thin. Well, this silk is thin. But now they're going to be little V's pointing up. And notice the next line of the pattern is the same as the previous line. So all that moves is the selvage, because this is white. Turns forward, turns back. And now we can see the new V's that are no longer upside down on the edge of the selvage. And just to finish out the one pattern, I'm going to do this last row here. And again, I need to feed more string away from the hole. And the selvage goes back to the foreground. And on these, again, we're losing one card from the outside on each side. And selvage goes forwards, and the other one goes backwards. And when you first start weaving double face, you spend a lot of time muttering about the selvage. Selvage goes forwards, selvage goes forward. When you ever find yourself saying selvage goes backwards, you're doing it wrong. But now what's happening is the selvage is slowly beginning to untwist. And eventually it will become completely twisted up in the opposite direction, at which point you again flip the cards the same way we did, and then it will start going in the other way.